They heard it before they saw it. A distant howl tearing through the sky, growing louder, faster, angrier. German tank crews froze inside their steel monsters, gripping their controls as a terrifying shadow swept over the treetops. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't a bomber. It was something new, something designed to hunt them. A single Thunderbolt screamed downward, its wings loaded with rockets that glinted like metal fangs. And then, the world erupted. Tanks that once felt invincible were thrown into fire and twisted steel. Commanders shouted into radios that suddenly went dead. Crews abandoned their panzers and ran, leaving behind machines they once believed could survive anything. For the first time in the war, German armor wasn't fighting the enemy in front of them. They were running from the sky. Because when America unleashed its rocket-firing Thunderbolts, the battlefield belonged to the P-47. By 1944, the battlefields of Europe had transformed into vast arenas of steel, fire, and desperation. The German war machine, once feared for its armored dominance, relied heavily on its panzers to slow the relentless Allied advance. These tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and the trusted Panzer IV, had carved their reputation through brutal efficiency and battlefield terror. But the skies above Europe were changing. The Allies had gained something priceless, air superiority. And with it came innovation. Enter the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a rugged, heavyweight fighter built not only for aerial duels but for a new kind of warfare, precision strikes against ground targets. When engineers equipped it with high-velocity rockets capable of piercing armor, the Thunderbolt evolved from a fighter into a flying sledgehammer. German tank commanders knew Allied air attacks were dangerous. But they had never seen anything like this. The P-47 didn't merely attack, it hunted. Flying low, fast, and ruthlessly close to the ground, Thunderbolt pilots learned to strike at angles German tank armor couldn't survive. Columns that once moved confidently now crawled under tree cover, hoping the shadows would hide them. The battlefield had shifted. And for German tank crews, the sky had become their deadliest enemy. Long before German tank crews felt the terror of rocket-firing Thunderbolts, the story began in the planning rooms of Allied engineers who knew one truth: to break the German war machine, they had to break its armor. The Panzers were the backbone of Hitler's defense across Western Europe. Even after years of war, German tank divisions still carried a reputation for discipline, precision, and deadly effectiveness. Their confident march across the continent had been powered by carefully coordinated armor tactics, fast movement, powerful guns, and thick frontal plates that absorbed punishment. But something had shifted. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence was reporting that German armored units were no longer advancing, they were bracing. Their fuel was limited, their supply lines stretched thin, and their numbers dwindling. Yet the Germans still believed in one advantage: their tanks could withstand almost anything from the air. They'd survived strafing runs, machine gun bursts, even low-level bombing. Tigers and Panthers had shrugged off countless attacks, roaring forward with only scorched paint to show for it. Meanwhile, American pilots were mastering the rugged, bulky aircraft that would soon rewrite tank warfare, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Unlike the sleek Spitfires or nimble Mustangs, the Thunderbolt was built like a flying fortress, massive, heavily armored, and powered by a monstrous engine that allowed it to dive faster than any aircraft the Germans had encountered. Pilots joked that it didn't fly through the air, it pushed the sky out of the way. But its true transformation began when a simple yet devastating idea emerged. What if the Thunderbolt didn't just fire bullets, but rockets? The introduction of high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, changed everything. These were not ordinary explosives. They were narrow, piercing steel projectiles capable of punching straight through armor, something no machine gun could ever achieve. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt had fangs. As training intensified, American pilots learned to strike tanks not from above, but from angles where German armor was weakest. They mastered low-altitude approaches that brought them terrifyingly close to the ground, sometimes so close that German infantry swore they could see the pilot's goggles. These attacks weren't random. They were precise, coordinated, and designed to break the psychological backbone of tank crews who were trained to fight forward, not upward. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Their tanks were ready for a battle of steel. But the Allies were preparing a battle of thunder. The first time German tank crews witnessed the true fury of the rocket-armed Thunderbolt, it was not on some grand battlefield, but on a narrow forest road in Normandy. A Panther battalion was moving cautiously through the countryside, its engines rumbling like distant thunder. The men inside the tanks were tense but confident. Air attacks had become routine. Machine gun strafing was annoying, bombs were terrifying, but their armor, especially on the Panther and Tiger, had always held firm. But that morning, something felt different. A faint whistle rolled across the treetops, growing louder, sharper, like the sky tightening its breath. German commanders scanned upward, expecting the familiar silhouette of Allied fighters. Instead, a massive aircraft burst through the clouds at a steep angle, sunlight flashing across its wings. It wasn't dropping bombs. It wasn't pulling away. It was diving straight toward them. It was a P-47 Thunderbolt, and it wasn't hunting. It was attacking. The first rockets shot from its wings with a scream so sharp it cut through steel and bone. German tankers had no time to react. Within seconds, a white streak tore through the air and slammed into the lead Panther. The explosion was nothing like machine gun fire or bombs they had endured before. This was a deep, violent punch. The front armor buckled. Flames erupted from the turret ring. The crew inside never stood a chance. Before anyone could process the destruction, more Thunderbolts swept in behind the first, their wings heavy with rockets and their engines howling like monsters. They flew so low that infantry on the roadside dove into ditches, convinced the planes would crash into the ground. But the P-47 pilots were masters of low-altitude warfare, skimming just above the trees before pulling upward into another attack run. Another rocket salvo roared out. A Panzer IV was hit square on its engine deck, the rocket slicing through the thin rear armor like a knife through paper. The tank burst into a fireball, throwing its turret several meters into the air. Shockwaves rolled through the German formation. Commanders yelled frantic orders over the radio, but static swallowed their words. The entire column stalled, trapped on the open road, exposed. Tank crews began abandoning their vehicles. It was a sight unheard of early in the war, when German armor was the terror of Europe. But now, grown men sprinted from their panzers, diving into hedgerows, covering their heads as the Thunderbolts circled like hungry predators. Inside one Tiger tank, the commander shouted at his driver to reverse into the woods. The Tiger began backing up, its enormous body lurching violently. But before it could escape, a rocket slammed into the ground just meters away, flipping the 80-ton giant onto its side. The crew crawled out, shaken and bloody, stunned that their invincible machine had been overturned not by artillery, but by a single aircraft. Above them, the Thunderbolts regrouped, banking sharply in the sunlight. They weren't done yet. The sky had claimed the battlefield. The German High Command quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Reports coming from the front were chaotic and unbelievable. Armored columns destroyed in minutes, Tigers overturned, Panthers pierced through their thickest armor, an entire battalion scattered by aircraft that flew lower than any bomber had dared. At first, commanders dismissed the reports as exaggerations caused by battlefield panic. But survivor testimonies all described the same nightmare. Thunderbolts with rockets, they came out of nowhere. This was not just a new weapon. It was a new kind of warfare. As Thunderbolt squadrons swept across northern France, German armor doctrine began to collapse. Tank crews who once operated with machine-like discipline were now making mistakes, abandoning defensive positions, firing blindly at the sky, or driving into forests where their tanks became easy targets for infantry ambushes. The fear of air attack had become stronger than the fear of Allied ground forces. One field report noted. The men look upward more than forward. That single sentence captured the turning point of the campaign. Thunderbolt pilots learned to exploit this psychological weakness. Instead of attacking once and leaving, they circled above German lines for long, punishing minutes. The roar of their engines was enough to paralyze entire armored units. A single P-47 Shadow could halt a column of 20 tanks. Commanders refused to move until the sky was clear, but by the time they advanced, the opportunity was gone. The Allies were no longer just attacking Germans. They were breaking their rhythm, their confidence, their core doctrine of rapid movement. On the ground, German tank commanders attempted desperate countermeasures. Camouflaging tanks under thick foliage helped for a time, but Thunderbolt pilots quickly adapted, using smoke trails and dust patterns to spot hidden armor. Moving at night reduced exposure, but then supply lines slowed, communication broke, and fuel shortages became catastrophic. In one particularly devastating episode near the Falaise Pocket, an entire German column attempted to retreat under cover of dusk. They believed darkness would protect them. But the Allies had anticipated this, and P-47 squadrons were already waiting, flying low with the fading light behind them. The Thunderbolts struck with terrifying precision, firing rockets into tightly packed tanks stuck on narrow roads. The sky turned into a killing field, lit by fireballs that marked the end of German hopes for organized withdrawal. Survivors later said the same thing. It felt like the sky itself was hunting us. The turning point had come not through a single battle or strategic breakthrough, but through growing despair spreading like a virus through German armored units. Their greatest strength, armored dominance, had become their greatest vulnerability. Every tank movement risked attracting the wrath of Thunderbolts. And once the rockets started falling, nothing could save them. The aftermath of the Thunderbolt rocket assaults was felt far beyond the burning wrecks on French roads. The devastation spread like a shockwave through the German military machine, unraveling years of armored doctrine that had once been the envy of the world. High-ranking officers began receiving reports that seemed impossible: armored divisions reduced to half-strength without engaging a single Allied tank, fuel convoys abandoned after one airstrike, and seasoned crews refusing to advance during daylight. In the shattered remains of tank battalions, the psychological toll was undeniable. German tank crews, once celebrated for their iron discipline, now lived in a constant state of dread. They slept inside barns instead of tanks, hiding under trees, listening for the distant growl of aircraft engines. Some crews painted crude camouflage stripes overnight, others hid their tanks under destroyed buildings, and many split from their units just to avoid moving in predictable formations. But none of it sufficed. The P-47 Thunderbolt had altered the ground war in a way no weapon had done before. Allied infantry and armored units quickly recognized the shift. Where once they approached German positions cautiously, now they advanced with newfound confidence. Burned-out Panthers and overturned Tigers marked the landscape like twisted monuments to a fading empire. Allied soldiers joked that the Thunderbolts had become the tank busters, but in reality, they were something more: a force multiplier that tipped the balance of the entire Western Front. In the fields around St. Lo, a captured German officer admitted during interrogation, "We do not fear your tanks anymore. We fear your sky." This single statement spoke volumes. The battlefield had transformed. German tank crews no longer maneuvered as hunters, they maneuvered as prey. Their commanders were forced to rewrite manuals, shifting from aggressive tactics to desperate defensive measures that often contradicted the very principles of blitzkrieg. The proud, thunderous advance of German armor had slowed to a cautious crawl. The consequences were strategic and immediate. Every destroyed tank meant more than just metal lost, it meant critical shortages that Germany could never replace. Factories in the homeland were bombed, resources strained, and fuel shipments dangerously low. The more Thunderbolts struck, the more Germany's armored divisions disintegrated both physically and mentally. In the Falaise Gap alone, Thunderbolt rocket strikes contributed to the destruction of hundreds of German vehicles. Columns that had once roared through Europe were now graveyards of blackened steel, scattered along hedgerows and village roads. Survivors spoke of the attacks with a kind of shell-shocked reverence, as if describing storms sent by the gods. And as the Allies advanced deeper into France, the combination of air power and ground coordination became an unstoppable force. German tank crews, exhausted and broken, understood a harsh truth: their armor, once feared across the continent, could no longer dominate the battlefield. The sky had become the new front line. And the Thunderbolt ruled it. In the end, the rocket-firing Thunderbolt did more than destroy German tanks, it shattered the very foundation of German armored confidence. What began as a calculated attempt by the Allies to weaken enemy armor evolved into a turning point that reshaped the psychology of the battlefield. German tank crews, once the embodiment of fearlessness, now lived under the constant shadow of a threat they couldn't fight, couldn't predict, and couldn't escape. For years, German armor had defined the war in Europe. Tigers had become legends. Panthers were symbols of engineering mastery. Even the older Panzer IV held its ground through countless battles. But no amount of armor or training could prepare them for a weapon that struck from angles they couldn't defend, at speeds they couldn't track, and with destructive force they couldn't survive. The Thunderbolt proved that air power was no longer a support element, it was a decisive weapon, capable of changing the fortunes of entire divisions in a single pass. Its rockets, once an experiment, became the nightmare of armored crews across the Western Front, carving a new chapter in military evolution. By the time the war pushed into Germany, the legend of the rocket-firing Thunderbolt had spread so widely that even hearing one overhead was enough to break the spirit of retreating forces. The skies that once echoed with Luftwaffe dominance were now ruled by a new predator. And for German tank crews, the roar of a P-47 Thunderbolt would forever be remembered as the sound of defeat descending from above. History often remembers wars through the lens of generals, strategies, and massive battles, but sometimes, it is the unseen moments of fear and transformation that shape the outcome. The story of the rocket-firing Thunderbolt is one such moment. Not because it was the most advanced aircraft of the war, nor because it carried the deadliest weapons, but because it changed the emotions of the battlefield. For the German tank crews, this wasn't just a new enemy, it was a new reality. A reality where steel walls no longer guaranteed safety, where movement became a gamble, and where survival depended not on skill, but on whether the sky stayed quiet for one more hour. For the Allied pilots, the mission was clear: break the armored spearhead that had terrorized Europe for years. And with every rocket fired, every tank struck, and every convoy halted, they pushed the war one step closer to liberation. Today, the wrecks of those tanks lie silent across Europe, rusted reminders of a time when the roar of a P-47 could decide the fate of an entire column. But their story still speaks, a reminder that in war, innovation reshapes everything, and courage isn't always found on the ground. Sometimes it comes screaming from the sky.